Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Managing Water Sustainably with Development Management Perspective RTPI session. Good afternoon. I'm Kieran Blaydes, the incoming Vice Chair of the Northwest RTPI region. We've got Laura Makeating and Sophie Tucker as well today with us to talk through this SuDS session. Just run through a few quick housekeeping rules before we get on to the session, and I pass on to Laura and Sophie. You've all arrived and your camera and your microphone is on mute. Please don't turn that on. Stay as you are. If you do have any questions, please submit in the bottom right hand corner. There's a column with the drop down arrow that says questions. Please drop your questions in there. And if possible, if we get time at the end of the session, I will ask Laura and Sophie to answer some of those questions. If we don't get time, which we probably won't do to answer all of those questions, there are quite a lot of you on today. We can circulate those answers to those questions from Laura and Sophie following the session. As well, we can also circulate a copy of the presentation following the session is finished, so don't worry about notes, etc. Just to introduce Laura and Sophie, Laura's going to be speaking first. Laura Makeating is from Lancashire County Council, and she is currently the Principal Flood Risk Manager for the County Council there. And I'll pass on to Laura to take the presentation away. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Kieran, and good afternoon, everybody. And thank you very much for taking the time today to listen to Sophie and I talk about sustainable water management. I'm just going to start with the next slide, please, Sophie, which is a bit of an overview about what the purpose of the CPD webinar is and who it's for today. So the main aim of the event is to have a better understanding of what sustainable drainage systems are and what their components are. So in other words, the different types of sustainable drainage components that make up a sustainable drainage system. I'm going to talk about the relationship of sustainable drainage to the planning process and opportunities that well-planned SuDS can afford as well. But also, crucially, why it is right to get sustainable drainage correctly designed on development in the first place. We also recognise that there'll be a lot of different people from different backgrounds in the session today. Some of you will know quite a lot about sustainable drainage, others will know not a lot at all. So the sort of format of the presentation today is really to try and cover all bases. But if you've got any questions, then we'd love to take those at the end. Next slide, please. So in terms of an overview of what we're going to be talking about at this lunchtime, we will going to start off with a bit of background information about sustainable drainage systems. So a brief history to how we've come to where we are today, and also some of the changes that have happened more recently. Looking at different types of flood risk and the roles and responsibilities of the various flood risk management authorities for those different types of flood risk as well. Then we'll talk about actually what are SuDS and give a bit of information about those, and the policy requirements and the importance of sustainable drainage. After that, I'll then hand over to Sophie, who's going to talk us through some examples, challenges and lessons learned, the new ways of working which we've come up with, particularly in the northwest of England, and then talking about water industry adoption, which commenced on the 1st of April 2020. Some changes that are on the horizon, which mean that we need to be on the ball with those, not just as flood risk management authorities, but crucially as planners as well. And then, of course, some useful links before we do some questions and answers. Next slide, please. So in terms of a bit of background, this slide really is to just show fundamentally that flood risk isn't anything new. Of course, the Flood and Water Management Act commenced in 2010, following the 2007 floods, and the very clear recommendation made to government that there was some new legislation required for flood and water management to be able to manage that more effectively and more efficiently. So of course that's 10 years old now, and we feel like a lot's happened since then, and we've learned a lot along the way. Of course, in 2012, the original MPPF was launched, and crucially, because there was new flood risk policies included in the National Planning Policy Framework in 2012, any new homes built after the 1st of January 2012 are not eligible for flood defence grant funding from the government. So in other words, if there are any new build properties that experience flooding, unfortunately, as SuDS management authorities, we're not able to bid for any grant funding to resolve those issues. That therefore underlines the importance of designing sustainable drainage systems and drainage systems in general on development correctly in the first place, to ensure that they have the mitigation built in and that they're built to the required standards. Because once they are built, there is nothing that we can do to alleviate those issues in terms of capital funding. In 2015, of course, the lead local flood authority became a statutory consultee for surface water on major developments. And that is a role that certainly I've grown into in the county council and my previous roles as well. And of course, Syria released a new SuDS manual. In 2018 and 19, there was a number of changes then as well, particularly around in Wales, Schedule 3 of the Flood and Water Management Act, which is the SuDS approval body, that was actually enacted in Wales. That's not been the case in England. The 25-year environment plan was released by DEFRA, and of course in 2019 there was the revised National Planning Policy Framework, which further strengthens some policies in there in relation to sustainable drainage, both flood and water management, and also climate resilience more broadly as well. This year alone there's been a lot of changes. So of course we've got the voluntary SuDS adoption that has come in, that Sophie will talk to us a little bit about later on. There was also the new National Flood and Coastal Erosion Risk Management Strategy. It was launched in the summer. There was a new flood risk policy statement that came along with that. Of course, the planning white paper consultation came out. There was a review of surface water flood risk and how that is managed by a chap called Jenkins. And of course, we've got the Environment Bill as well, still going through Parliament as well. So there's been a whole host of changes since 2010. But the key thing here is that a lot of the changes have been about environmental improvement and not just around focusing on flood and water management. Next slide, please, Sophie. Okay, so in terms of types of flood risk, there are different types of flood risk, and it's really important that you understand the difference between these, because there are different flood risk management authorities that manage these different types of risk. So of course you've got flooding from the sea, so that is where typically during storm conditions coastal defences are overtopped, or are, sand dunes are eroded and people's homes, properties, highways, etc. The built environment can become inundated temporarily, usually from seawater. Of course, you've got flood risks and watercourses, and watercourses have got two main classifications. The first one being main river, and then the second one being ordinary. The difference between these is main rivers typically, not always, but typically tend to be those larger watercourses. So like the River Alt, the River Ribble, etc. Those are larger watercourses that we tend to associate with and tend to know as main rivers. Ordinary watercourses, by contrast, tend to be much smaller watercourses. They can run dry sometimes, they can just be ditches, but in fact they are ordinary watercourses. And the easiest way to tell the difference, or to tell whether a watercourse is a main river or ordinary, is by going on the Environment Agency's rivers map. Quite simply, if it's not listed as a main river, it's an ordinary watercourse. You've got flooding from surface water, so put simply, that's where the water, the rain falls on land and it runs off, typically gathers in low points, and or occurs where the ground is saturated and it simply can't take any more water, in which case it will simply sit on the surface. Groundwater flooding, of course, that can happen in a couple of key ways, but the classic one is where after a prolonged period of rainfall, the ground is simply saturated and the water table rises to the surface where it sits on the surface. Highway flooding is, of course, where water runs off the highway and can again run into the built environment, causing problems there. But it can also just simply sit on the highway, causing issues for infrastructure. Public sewer flooding, so this is there's three main types of public sewers. We've got the foul sewer system, which is where sort of the foul waste goes in there, so all the bits and pieces we don't like to talk about, the nasties, if you like. And then we've got surface water sewers, which take away surface water, so that can be run off from highways, it can be run off from impermeable area, but it can also be They're the main two types. And then the final one is, of course, a combined sewer, which is a combination of foul and surface water, but they are typically only found now on older developments, because all newer developments now require separate surface water and foul sewers to be built. Next slide, please. So when we look at the different flood risk and we put on top of that the flood risk management authorities, you can see that there are a number of different flood risk management authorities, and these include the Environment Agency, who are responsible from rivers from the sea, flooding from the sea, and also flooding from main rivers, which you can see on the box on the right hand side there. You've got the Lead Local Flood Authority, which is responsible for regulating flood risk from surface water, groundwater, and also from ordinary watercourses. You've got flooding on the highway, whose responsibility it remains of the Highway Authority. So that is typically your county council or unitary authority, but it's a separate department within those councils typically. And then, of course, the Water and Sewage Company is responsible for flooding from sewers. Next slide, please. Okay, so what's the connection between flood risk and planning? Well, it sounds quite obvious, doesn't it? But put simply, if any new development or redevelopment or any changes in land use are not properly managed, they could negatively impact on our environment. By increasing the surface water flood risk during rainfall events, lead to an increase in flood risk either on site or elsewhere. They could also increase the number of properties at risk. So, for example, if you build properties in a floodplain or in a surface water flood zone where it's inappropriate to build those properties, you could put more properties at risk of flooding. And as I said earlier, any property built after the 1st of January 2012 is not eligible for funding from the government to resolve those issues. Development can also increase or change the vulnerability of users as well. So, for example, if you are converting your business premises into flats, that is from a less vulnerable use to a more vulnerable use. So in those scenarios, you need to think about things like emergency access and things like that. So these are some of the less obvious ones in comparison to perhaps point 1 and point 2. And the photograph on the bottom right there is an actual real live site allocation that I dealt with way back in 2014-15, prior to the storm Frank, Desmond, Eva in December 2015, and that photograph was taken not long afterwards. So it just highlights the importance of ensuring that any site allocations are properly assessed through the strategic flood risk assessment process. Next slide, please. One of the things Sophie and I don't want to do today is we don't want to focus on the negatives of flood risk and planning. We also want to look at what the positives are and what the opportunities are that development can bring. So we recognise that new development and redevelopment or changes in land use is also an opportunity, because we can better manage flood risk by better managing our water on those sites, so that it becomes less of a problem and more of a feature. Leading on to point 2 is we can enhance the landscape of flooding. So what I mean by that is where you do have site allocations, which part of the site allocation is in flood zone 2 or 3, or is it surface water flood risk, rather than simply just leaving that land undeveloped to soak up that water, actually looking at that as an opportunity for enhancing that flooded area. So, for example, could we make up a wetland or some form of habitat that will enhance the biodiversity as well? So if we have to leave it undeveloped, okay, fine, but what can we do to improve and enhance that area of attenuation, if you like, or that area where we're going to allow it to safely flood? Point 3 is around contributing towards a network of blue-green spaces, providing amenity value and a range of benefits to people who live on those developments and also visit and work on them as well. So, for example, there's loads of health benefits where, you know, people like to be alongside water. It's supposed to be very calming. It attracts loads of wildlife. It contributes towards biodiversity net gain. It encourages people to get outside. So there's loads of benefits of putting in blue-green sustainable drainage features, and they can contribute towards that blue-green infrastructure requirement and network as well, that I know some areas of the country do have. But they also help to create homes which are climate resilient and built with our future needs in mind. So in other words, when we design, or when we are asking developers to design sustainable drainage systems today, we're asking them to design those with climate change in mind. And by doing that, it means that those developments are flood resilient and flood resistant in a way that potentially more traditional older developments were not built with that in mind. So it is about forward thinking. It is about thinking about sustainable drainage and about flood risk management as part of that overall climate resilience picture, and not just in isolation as one issue. Next slide, please. So in terms of what are sustainable drainage systems and what do they do? Well, sustainable drainage systems are designed to control surface water runoff close to where it falls and to mimic natural drainage as closely as possible. That you can find in the planning practice guidance under the flood risk and coastal change section. Sustainable drainage systems have fundamentally 4 pillars. They quantity, quality, amenity and biodiversity. Water quantity looks at controlling the quantity of runoff from development to support the management of flood risk and maintain and protect the natural water cycle. The quality aspect is looking at managing the quality of the runoff to prevent pollution. So in other words, how do we require a treatment train to be installed to capture those pollutants and ensure that they're not causing an issue further downstream in those watercourses? And not just our watercourses, but our bathing waters as well, because we often forget that, you know, eventually that water has to go somewhere, and we want to make sure that it not only improves our water quality, but also our bathing water quality as well. In terms of biodiversity, helping to create and sustain better places for nature, contributing towards biodiversity net gain and natural capital. And of course, amenity, to create and sustain better places for people. So that's all about the urban design, it's about the placemaking, it's about what sort of communities do we want to build going forward, and how are we integrating sustainable drainage at the heart of that to allow that to be achieved effectively. Just some photographs there on the bottom, just to give you an example of a swale, which is one sustainable drainage component. You can see what it looks like there in dry weather and what it looks like in a storm event. And it's a really good way of communicating to residents and politicians and other people who visit the area as to what, you know, the fact that that swale is actually doing its job. It's not a problem, the fact that it's filled up, it's actually doing its job. Next slide, please. So in terms of what sustainable drainage components there are, they can be broadly split into 3 categories. The first one being source control, which basically means that the water, where it falls at source, those components will help to gather that and to manage it really well. Source control measures are particularly good for managing everyday rainfall. So they're those either short, drizzly events, or the ones that aren't particularly heavy rainfall. It's just that everyday rainfall that we do see, and they're particularly effective at managing that and actually holding the water back out of the drainage system entirely by helping it to absorb into the ground and to capture it through things like water butts, green roofs, grey water waste recycling systems and things like that. So basically it's about how do we capture that water and how can we prevent that from getting into the system in the first place. The second one is then looking at conveyance. So these are sort of transport sustainable drainage components. They can be both rural and urban. A really good example is shown on the photographs there, where you can see a linear swale, which is green, which is integrated within the housing development there on sort of on the right hand side, the left one on the right hand side, compared to the sort of concrete rill on the top right, which is as you can see in an urban area, and it's separating an area there where pedestrians walk, service vehicles go through that urban centre, between that and some bike storage facilities as well. So it just goes to show that you can incorporate these conveyance sustainable drainage components really well within both urban and rural landscapes. And the other type of sustainable drainage components is around attenuation. So these components are fundamentally about storage of the water. So in other words, it's a little bit like having a bath, and you fill the bath up, you've got the plug at the bottom, and then what then happens is that you, instead of taking the plug completely out, you sort of have it half in, half out. allowing that water to slowly release at a controlled rate of discharge. And essentially these components are the bath that allow that attenuation to take place. They are those storage facilities. So in the photographs there, you can see there is a pond on the bottom left, which is a business headquarters there for Matalan, and that shows there where they've got a pond there adjacent to their offices, providing lots of amenity value, providing biodiversity value, providing somewhere where staff can go and enjoy the lunch breaks as well. The bottom middle one is a type of sustainable drainage component called geocellular storage tanks. So these are of course underground. Obviously they don't deliver all the high quality benefits that we would like to see from SuDS, like the amenity and the biodiversity, but they are appropriate to be used where the other measures are unsuitable or they are not viable for whatever reason. But of course, it's just that acknowledgement that they don't deliver the multiple benefits that the higher quality, greener, sustainable components do. And on the right there, you've got an attenuation swale in this case, where that is actually almost like a linear pond that's filling up there on another housing development. Next slide, please. So what does the National Planning Policy Framework say about sustainable drainage systems? Well, it says quite a lot. It talks about everything from preventing development, from the adverse effects of water and improve local conditions, to responding to climate change, to building that resilience and that future climate need that we spoke about. It talks about providing adaptive measures to help reduce the vulnerability of places to flooding as well. But principally, paragraphs 155 to 165 are the really meaty, chunky section, looking at sustainable drainage, but also flood risk management more generally. And they talk about using a SuDS approach to help locate development in appropriate places. So in other words, moving development away from those high-risk flood areas, and not just flood zone 3, which corresponds with fluvial flood zone, but also with high surface water flood risk zones as well. It helps us to assess the suitability of development and preventing flooding by making the new developments flood resilient and flood resistant. It helps to provide measures to enable development and to mitigate problems. But one of the biggest things that I've noticed from a policy perspective is that it includes a new safeguarding policy option there to allow planners to actually set aside and safeguard land for current and future development. So particularly around sustainable drainage systems, I've started to have conversations with planners in my area now about going forward with their local plan revisions, whether they would look at safeguarding, particularly on major developments, a percentage of those sites for allowing sustainable drainage systems to be put on those sites in the same way that we can safeguard or require a percentage of a major development for public open space, for example. But let's not forget, sustainable drainage systems can be multi-benefit and multi-use, and therefore looking at opportunities to integrate public open space with sustainable drainage as well. So there are ways and means around some of these things, but fundamentally the NPPF says that we should be using sustainable drainage systems unless they are not viable, and there's lots of advice in the planning practice guidance about what constitutes as not being viable as well. Next slide, please. The other thing I just wanted to draw your attention to under the National Planning Policy Framework is the requirement to have a site-specific flood risk assessment under footnote 50 of the NPPF. So what this requires is developers to assess flood risk to and from the site and elsewhere as a result of the development. And it's required for all development in flood zone 2 and 3, and for flood zone 1, all the proposals for a hectare or more land which has been identified as having critical drainage problems or critical drainage areas, as it's sometimes called. Land identified in the strategic flood risk assessment as being an increased risk of flooding in the future, and of course land that may be subject to other sources of flooding. The other thing that you may be familiar, the other term you may be familiar with, is the sustainable drainage strategy, and you will hear your lead local flood authority colleagues and potentially your water and sewage company colleagues asking for this to be provided as well. And I often get the question asked, what is the difference between these two documents? Well, put simply, the site-specific flood risk assessment is required under the NPPF, and it's a factual assessment of what is the flood risk or flood risks to the site. and what recommendations are being made for mitigating those risks. The sustainable drainage strategy then is informed by the site-specific flood risk assessment and should use the recommendations from that flood risk assessment to actually go out and therefore design a sustainable drainage strategy or sustainable drainage system for that site, if that makes sense. Both of these are required on the majority of major developments. They should be quite familiar in their terminology, and typically most flood risk management authorities will ask for one at the very least, but usually for both. Next slide, please. Regardless of what the NPPF says and regardless of what we say as flood risk management authorities, we absolutely have a dependency on the planning system to deliver successful sustainable drainage systems. That's all the way through from the initiation discussions around what are the ambitions of the local authority, what are the ambitions of the developer, through to the design of the sustainable drainage system and fundamentally the design of the development as a whole. And then looking at the approval stages, so getting that planning permission, the consultation process, etc., through to the construction, where the building control go out and will inspect. If there's any issues during construction, there need to be amendments, and particularly non-material amendments, those planning permissions. Again, that is down to planners. Through down to maintenance and enforcement as well of any of those planning conditions if things do go topsy-turvy as well. So there's an absolute dependency on our development management planners and the planning system to be able to deliver those successful SuDS. There's only so much we can do as flood risk management authorities, and we are absolutely committed to working with you and building those relationships to enable that integrated working to happen to deliver those high quality sustainable drainage systems. Next slide, please. One of the things I just wanted to touch on today was looking at the hierarchy of drainage options. So fundamentally, this has come from the planning practice guidance, and this describes and explains how surface water or surface water from a development site is expected to be discharged in order. So developers are expected to explore how they would discharge or how they would get rid of that water by putting it into the ground through infiltration, then putting it into a surface water body such as a pond or a swale or a watercourse, and then looking at discharging it to a surface water sewer, a highway drain or another sustainable drain or another drainage system, before then, as a last resort, then looking at a combined sewer option. One of the things that Sophie and I have been really trying to do in the Northwest is actually turning the hierarchy in its head from a hierarchy of hoops that developers have to jump through to actually looking at it as an opportunity hierarchy. So how can you use water as a resource on the development to start with? So how can you integrate it within the urban design of the development? How can you use it to get those biodiversity benefits? How can we ensure that we deliver high quality design on those new developments? Then, once we've exhausted how we can use that as a resource, how can we then use the ground as a sponge to take some of that water? So all ground will take some water out of a system. There is a number of tests that need to be, technical testing that needs to be done to prove what it can and can't hold. But fundamentally, it's about once we've looked at how we can capture that water, how can we then put it into the ground and use that land as a sponge to take some of that water? Before then looking at the water as an asset. So as I said earlier about, creating spaces, creating ponds, creating urban design and amenity value on that site. Before then finally getting rid of it through control in a controlled way. So rather than looking at it as a series of hoops to jump through, to encourage developers to look at it as a series of opportunities in that design process. And hopefully this just helps to turn it on its head and think about how you can look at sustainable drainage systems more as an opportunity rather than an obstacle to development. Next slide, please. In terms of the benefits of sustainable drainage systems, there are so many benefits, and we've spoken about already about quite a lot of those, but they help to facilitate sustainable economic development, high quality and inclusive design, regeneration opportunities. They protect and enhance the environment. They can create urban resilience as well. They obviously contribute towards biodiversity net gain and natural capital, and towards a low carbon economy and transition towns. They contribute towards really great space and placemaking, and of course they help develop a focal point for communities. We just want to draw your attention as well to a tool that has been developed by CIRIA, C-I-R-I-A, which is called the BEST tool, which helps measure the multiple benefits of sustainable drainage systems. And at the end of the presentation, you can find a link through to the BEST tool there as well for you to use after the presentation today. Next slide, please. Okay, so policy plus development management equals successful SuDS. So the starting point for development management decisions is the development plan, and a key material consideration of that is, of course, flood risk management and looking at how we can contribute towards blue and green infrastructure and how we can build in climate resilience. But whilst the NPPF is good in many ways, its overarching purpose and function means that in its content and instructions tend to be both broad in tone. Local plans can contain really good policies regarding SuDS, even if these frequently involve interpretation and debate regarding their application. But things like supplementary planning documents and design codes can be really, really helpful when it comes to designing high quality sustainable drainage systems. So SPDs can help flesh out and give meaning to local plan policy by interpreting what the expectations are that the local authority expects to see, particularly on sustainable water management. And they can be referenced in policies detailing with urban design, green infrastructure, good highway design, climate resilience. So all those integrated themes that we've spoken about. Fundamentally though, we've got the NPPF at the top. We've now got an emerging number of combined authorities which are looking to adopt spatial development strategies, including one in my former patch of the Liverpool City region. We've of course got local and neighbourhood plans supported by those appropriate SPDs, design codes, etc. But fundamentally, in the here and now, you guys as development management planners are dealing with planning applications with the existing framework that you've got. So, you are really at the forefront of helping to drive forward high quality sustainable drainage systems and high quality urban design in the meantime. Next slide, please. Looking at what challenges that we've experienced over the last few years, there is a huge number of challenges associated with trying to encourage successful sustainable drainage systems that are high quality and do deliver those multiple benefits. The key ones for us are probably the fact that drainage is an afterthought and it's considered far too late in the planning process, essentially. So the minute that any developers come to talk to you about a major development site, absolutely drainage needs to be on the agenda from the very start. It needs to be integrated with any reserve matters on outline applications, particularly layout and landscaping as well, rather than looking at it and dealing with it at discharge conditions. It does need to be integrated with other aspects of development, absolutely. Another big one for me is language and leading by example. So of course we're here today talking to you about what we would like to see on new developments, but actually for a lot of local authorities in this country, it would be really beneficial if we led by example by installing on our own assets high quality sustainable drainage features where there are opportunities to either retrofit those or to start adopting those. So, for example, looking at our adopted highways, whether we can, particularly where we've got issues on those highways, whether there's any opportunities for retrofitting some sustainable drainage features to help manage the water, but also to deliver that wider climate resilience, contribute towards the blue-green infrastructure network, and generally create a greener and more pleasant county as well. The other big one for me out of all of these is probably getting the right information first time, as I'm sure you've all experienced objections time and time again from flood risk management authorities simply because they can't provide you with an informed substantive response because they've not got enough information from the developer on which to provide that. Therefore, one of the tools that we've come up with in the Northwest, we have the next slide please, as a bit of a way of starting to address that challenge of not getting the right information first time and not influencing the planning system early on enough to be able to integrate some of those high quality SuDS features, is we've looked to develop a Northwest Sustainable Drainage Proforma. And what that basically is a proforma which summarises and confirms what's in the sustainable drainage strategy, and what's in the site-specific flood risk assessment to help justify and evidence the approach that the developer has taken. But actually, it's not just for our benefit as flood risk management authorities, it helps you guys as planners as well, because you can give that out in pre-application discussions with clarity and certainty about what flood risk management authorities are expecting to see as part of those planning applications. Our advice to local planning authorities in the North West is that this should be required for all major developments, and therefore put on the planning validation checklist for major developments, and that this should be completed in full, and that the planning technicians ensure that that is the case before it comes to us. Of course, it's accompanied by guidance which explains how to complete that, and there's lots of hyperlinks within that to various standards and things like that that we expect them to reference and use during that design process. It isn't just a tick box process, it's actually a genuine tool that can be used throughout the planning process at multiple stages, helps to manage those expectations and facilitates the delivery of SuDS design to consistent adoption standards. Whether or not developers then offer the system for adoption is another matter, but it's about that consistency in the design standards going forward for us. The whole point around doing this is to reduce delays for everybody involved in the process, not just for us as flood risk managers, but for planners, for developers, for their consultants, to help people save time and obviously money as well in developing those developments. Of course, we want to see high quality SuDS, but we want to see them done right, and one way of doing that is by being clear on what it is that we expect to see. I'm now going to hand you over to Sophie, who's going to talk you through the next half of the presentation.
Thanks, Laura, for that great introduction. It's really good to sort of set the scene. So now I'm going to talk about some retrofit opportunities before I go into SuDS in new development in particular, talk a bit about adoption and the role of water and sewage companies in that process. Adoption is perceived as the biggest barrier. However, I personally think that that's been a bit of an excuse. And in my personal opinion, the biggest barrier to adoption is that surface water hasn't been considered as a material consideration at the earliest opportunity and is considered as detailed design to be resolved later. But hopefully some of the principles that Laura's set out in the presentation explains why it's got to be a real key spatial consideration before any housing layout is established. So I'll move on to my next slide. So just to highlight that SuDS opportunities can be created almost anywhere. So on the left-hand side, it shows how you can repurpose existing urban spaces. It's a case study from London, pocket parks, where you can see, you know, it provides, when you consider those amenity and biodiversity benefits, you know, it's a much nicer space through how they've amended that sort of stopping up area at the end and integrated that into it. We've got West Gorton's Carbon Sponge Park within Greater Manchester, and that's a very innovative way of managing water through that park space and linking it into play as well. On the top right hand corner, we've got Greener Grangetown in Cardiff. So this is a case study which is an award-winning case study on susdrain.com. And it's a really interesting case study because they've actually integrated SuDS as part of active neighbourhoods. So what was interesting here is sustainable drainage wasn't the driver. The driver here was that people kept getting knocked off their bikes. It's adjacent to the River Taff. It was one of the most used cycle routes within Cardiff. And when they were looking at changing the layout to make it more safer for sustainable travel and cyclist users, they also noted that actually it was a combined sewer infrastructure, and all surface water from those areas drained to that combined sewer, which was then pumped to treatment. So instead, what they did was look at, well, actually, as part of this repurposing, how can we integrate green infrastructure? How can we make it safer, you know, traffic calming, and then within that infrastructure actually attenuate and treat the water quality before discharge back into the River Taff. But I've also shown beneath that as well that SuDS can be integrated within school environments. I'm having a lot of conversations at the moment with the Department for Education, who are looking at how they can have more SuDS in school environments, and we're looking at, you know, the standards so that how can we promote for every new site that they have sustainable drainage, which actually can be used as a teaching facility to engage children in geography, the water cycle, various science subjects, etc., especially in light of having to utilise and teach in spaces outdoors in light of COVID-19. So on this one that you'll hopefully be able to see now, it's a case study of the Queen Caroline estate in Hammersmith, London, and it's a retrofit scenario again where SuDS have been retrofitted within the existing landscape. So prior to the green up, it was okay. There was some green space, but perhaps not so widely used, fenced off. There's a lot of grey as well in terms of the paving. Looked a little bit, dilapidated, but actually as part of the regeneration there, they've retrofitted green roofs to existing garages. They've re-landscaped to create a swale and put the roof drainage into that swale, which will provide both conveyance and attenuation. And then they've got some innovative detention basins as well, with nice aesthetic and amenity values, with the bridge going across, and they've got then the swale and food growing areas. And one thing I'd like to reinforce here is good quality SuDS doesn't necessarily have to look like it's got a drainage purpose. They just fit in nicely with the landscape and just really have that placemaking value. So in terms of regeneration opportunities, so this is one from Greater Manchester that we'd previously commented on during planning. It was in a critical drainage area. So it's a change of use, conversion of 2 mills into apartment blocks. The existing connectivity is to the combined sewer, but there was opportunity to deliver some quality blue-green infrastructure here and ensure betterment beyond just controlling that rate of discharge. So how can you make use of that existing vegetated strip at the side of the building, bearing in mind the case study that I've just shown you? Is there an opportunity to reprofile it and reconfigure the roof drainage to use that as a conveyance swale? There was a reservoir that was there for the former use as mills. Is there an opportunity to use that rainwater as a resource, mimic the harvesting approach? Could that be for some of the building management services, for example? Reduce the demand on potable water and treat that rainwater as a resource. But now, before we go into the development sites, and I suppose this applies more to the greenfield site scenario, I just want to remind people of what the SuDS approach is. So it's informed by the site characteristics, and it tries to mimic the natural hydrology of a site. So Laura's talked before about source control. So how do we first and foremost use it as a resource? And then in terms of source control, how do we manage it close to where it falls? Manage runoff on the surface, allow it to soak into the ground via infiltration, promote evapotranspiration, which is fundamentally water being taken up by plants and transpired, as well as evaporation from the leaves. Slow and store that runoff to mimic what happens naturally, because it's not natural having hard surfaces that generate a lot of runoff quickly and take it to that receiving environment. And then how do we treat it as well as required? So these images are taken from the Syria manual that just shows that how can you consider where those natural flow paths are across the site and those areas that are suitable for infiltration. How can you then start considering, well, where does water naturally pond on that site based on, the topography and levels? Is there a natural low spot where water would naturally accumulate? And then thinking, okay, well, actually, can we have a linkage between the blue and green infrastructure on the site? So can we here utilise that for that water storage and provide that as part of our green space and public open space allocations? And then starting to map out the network of where that drainage may need to go. And then lastly, once you start having houses there, how do you look at the exceedance routes so that actually you've got, climate resilient infrastructure and development, that housing layout's been informed by how water flows across that site and how, a flood and exceedance condition would go across the site as well. So again, SuDS and blue-green infrastructure, there's a natural and strong relationship with them, just to reinforce that. It's about working with the natural landscape, and it's central to the delivery and performance of SuDS. It is just a key function of blue-green infrastructure. So I'm conscious we did talk a lot about flooding earlier on, because I think that's really important for people to have that awareness. But actually, all sites, regardless of size, location, flood risk, How do we make sustainable drainage business as usual to access all those wider benefits? So some points to think about. So I guess this is learning from experience now as we start to talk a bit about adoption in a minute. So there's a lot of evidence that well-designed SuDS provide many health benefits. The blue-green space is important for urban quality of life. It helps with things like air quality improvements, moderate extreme temperatures, heat island effect, etc., mental health and well-being, and promoting physical activity. But one key thing is actually well-designed SuDS for amenity are also usually safe SuDS. And that's just one thing that I want people to think, how can you look at that earlier? Because as well, that'll also mean that it's more likely to be in accordance with best practice guidance in terms of its design, which therefore means it could be adopted, because we do have challenges where we don't actually, we're unable to adopt some systems that are presented because everything's fixed and they haven't actually designed it in accordance with standards. So the better looking and more natural it looks, the more it tends to be welcomed by a community as well, and that's really important for placemaking and developing communities. And again, good visual appearance usually results in a safe design. So some key things to think about is when you're having discussions, is it a landscape-led approach? Is there a landscape architect working with a drainage engineer? Have they assessed the flow paths that were shown previously and those flow routes to inform that housing layout? How can they demonstrate that? Is there a blue-green infrastructure linkage? Have they got multifunctional space? Recent engagement on a site, there's over 55% green space retained, but they're actually struggling to use that locations to store the water. So it feels like a bit of a missed opportunity. And how have we got climate resilient and adaptive infrastructure as well in terms of appropriate amount of space that, if in 50 years time that needed to be adapted and improved, it could be again further because you've got the ability to do it working with the landscape. But from a developer's perspective, within United Utilities region, so in the northwest of England, we actually incentivise developers when surface water is kept out of the public sewer network. We do that through the infrastructure charge. More details is available on our website. But we typically offer a 90% discount to the sewerage infrastructure charge when surface water is kept out of the public sewer network, and they can deal with it through sustainable drainage systems to either ground or to watercourse. But also there's the opportunity as well for developers, when we think multifunctional, address these multiple needs through delivering SuDS that can provide contributions towards the likes of biodiversity net gain. It makes these things more affordable. So SuDS in new development, Laura talked about it earlier, adoption is voluntary within England. However, in the absence of SuDS approving bodies, the water and sewerage companies sought legal counsel through Water UK to say, well, actually thinking 21st century drainage, can we adopt certain SuDS components in the meaning of a sewer? So if it's constructed to drain domestic hard standing surfaces within the Act, that's known as drainage of buildings and yards pertinent to buildings. If it has a channel, and if it conveys and returns flows to an effective point of discharge in which we have lawful authority to discharge to, then actually, thinking of 21st century, you could regard that as a surface water sewer in some aspects. So in terms of the adoptable components, these are just images taken from the Syria manual. It just shows that these are ones that can potentially be adopted. Now, it's just important to say that we still don't have a legal basis to adopt SuDS, but instead we're saying certain SuDS can come within the meaning of a sewer. So it does feel like perhaps stronger policy and legislation is still needed within England. And our statutory obligation is actually to ensure we can effectively drain a site. So sometimes, there's just partnership approaches with local authorities and with management companies, etc., as well, in terms of maintaining things in accordance with any planning approved landscape management plan. So SuDS in new development, expectation versus reality. So I suppose this slide's a little bit tongue-in-cheek because the majority of the slide is showing what's regarded as best practice within the Syria manual. But actually, it's fair to say that the industry is learning, and if we continue to consider drainage as detailed to be sorted later, unfortunately, when they're retrofitted into an existing layout, you end up with something like this, which it's not a well integrated pond. It's in the corner of a site. It's silted up already. you're just missing those opportunities, and that's why it's got to be landscape led, in my personal view. Some observations, so just to highlight, you know, designs are typically end of pipe attenuation. We want to avoid angular shapes and corners, avoid use of a single gradient, but we also want people to specify products that are suitable. A head wall similar to this, you know, is perhaps not suitable for an area of public open space. And consideration also needs to be given when planting is established within that development site, not just to be left for a period of time so that you get a big weed problem. So yeah, just to give you some of those observations to date. This is an example SuDS pond designed to Syria C753. That should say basin actually, because it's an infiltration basin. But it was just showing you, giving you an insight of certain things that we as a water and sewage company have considered with regards to health and safety and maintenance. I won't go into maintenance, however, health and safety, you know, the fact that it's visible and overlooked by properties, the fact that it's usually a dry feature, its water depth is controlled, you know, the slope is compliant with the minimum design standards, and, you know, safety signage will be sufficient there to just educate people that that will fill with water in times of wet weather. And then you might not be able to see it here, but there's actually a clear exceedance route to make sure that, you know, in storm events above the 100-year plus 40% climate change, that if that did then overtop, it would be conveyed to a safer location away from the likes of a foul pumping station. So this is a pond showing you now, rather than design drawings, an actual example. So for maintenance in this one, we can actually park up if we wanted to in the site compound. They've got a sediment forebay with a hard engineered base, so we can just turn up and desilk that perhaps biannually, making sure it can effectively drain, as we said. But what's good about this is it's quite an innovative outfall design. It's sort of using gabion basket steps where it discharges down that slope to the watercourse. And it actually, so I should show you that on the screen just there. And it actually provides connectivity to an existing nature reserve. So again, you know, when we're thinking of amenity and biodiversity, there's a lot of value in doing that. So just to reinforce that, you know, changes are on the horizon. We are expecting the revised non-statutory technical standards for SuDS during spring 2021. And it's likely that, you know, the Northwest SuDS Task and Finish group will take account of those and update that document. And looking for people, if anyone is interested to get involved, that'd be great, you know, if you could drop us a line and let us know. The planning white paper, we know there's a lot going on there. They're looking at, you know, move towards technical details consent process, and could the performer approach facilitate that? But the non-statutory technical standards, you know, there's new opportunities in there around, you know, delivering interception, which is explained this time in a better way, perhaps through managing everyday rainfall, which hopefully will drive those types of SuDS that we want to see in terms of surface level conveyance for green infrastructure to achieve that. But should the long term for all of us as flood risk managers, planners, placemakers, designers, engineers, be to move away from below ground storage towards a bluer and greener future? Personally, I really think that should be what we aim for. And then in terms of further reading and sources of information, if you want to find out more after what you've learned today, there's just some sources, you know, susdrain.com, the SuDS manual, and then other recommended publications. The Cambridgeshire Flood and Water Supplementary Planning document is a really good document as well. So now I guess we'll go to discussion and Q&A, and hopefully we won't need these because some questions have come in, but we'll see. So thank you very much for listening. I'll now hand you over to the chair. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Sophie, and thank you, Laura. Some really, really good insight and content there. I think it was really useful from a planner's perspective just to see that sort of you know, how from a planning point of view, how it connects with the planning system. I mean, so to me as a planning consultant, it usually is something that is very technical that we do stay away from, or I try to, certainly at least. And it's quite, you know, it seems like a different language, so it was really useful insight. Some of the key things you pointed out there, Laura, I really like the idea of seeing it as an opportunity rather than a constraint, a validation requirement, a checklist that we need to overcome. See those sort of green infrastructure on the site, and look how we can incorporate those ecological features and recreation opportunities as well within development, and not just residential development, but urban regeneration schemes as well. Another point was about the safeguarding of such facilities within future development land, and how that connects, and how we're going to see that change with the white paper, well, hopefully coming in the next 18 months, or we'll see how that goes. But for that front loading of the process, that design process, how highways is such a big matter that we consider within planning and for future development, but we don't really consider flood risk, ahead to the same degree, and how we'll see that and the benefit and opportunities there will be interesting. We do have a few questions to work through. I've got 3 questions. 2 of them are more statements, so I'll come to the 3rd question I've got here. And sorry, I'm just reading off my other screen. So the question is, we have issues of proposed SuDS not complying entirely with the SuDS manual in respect to design and safety. We have started to ask developers to submit flood risk assessments, that seem to result in developers proposing fencing around attenuation ponds. But how do other authorities deal with this? So I assume this is from somebody working within a council, and to do with the risk assessments, to do with new drainage and SuDS facilities. Who's best to come to on this? Does anybody want to answer this question?
Probably you, Sophie.
I mean, for me, it's about the fact that the industry is learning. We've got some of those challenges ourselves in terms of people presenting for adoption. SuDS with steeply sided slopes, so that they're almost using the maximum that they can go for, which is a 1 in 3 slope, which is is fairly steep. And if you had that, you'd expect to see some sort of benching within that, so almost changes in the level and flat points, for someone to stand on if there was access and egress. It comes down to the SIRIA checklist. I think it's B.5, something like that, around health and safety. And it just requires that sensible conversation earlier, because really throughout the design as that's being developed, they should be trying to deal with and mitigate those risks without having to put a fence. When you think of SuDS as well, typically it's your toddlers, for example, that are at risk of getting in there. And you've got to look at, on the example I shared, that if they're visible and overlooked by properties, if you've got to actually cross a road and get a certain distance, the fact that they're usually dry, and it's only in wet weather that they're filling up, actually is a fence required, or is it something like some sort of toddler barrier, or barrier planting and that sort of thing? But fundamentally, it's because the industry is learning that that's why it's fair to say that some substandard designs are perhaps being proposed. So it's probably worth just saying, what conversations can be had earlier. What can you do to set that expectation around depths and that sort of thing, to then avoid the scenario where you'll get a design to that standard that then requires a designer to want to put a fence around it. I hope that answers it.
Yeah, I think it does. Have you got any comments on that at all, Laura?
For me, it underlines particularly what Sophie was saying earlier, what we were both saying earlier about sort of a landscape-led design. It's about integrating sort of within the landscape to make it look like they're part of the landscape, rather than that they've been plugged there with a fence around them. And as Sophie says, it is about that early integration of the design, including consideration of the health and safety aspects within that as well. And good design SuDS are those that are designed to look like they are part of the landscape and not that they've been plugged there. And I mean, a bit of common sense as well always prevails with these things as well. So, we've got canals, for example, rivers, they don't have fences around them. People can see them, they can see the danger. Every so often there might be a life buoy or whatnot on the canal for, emergency purposes. But it is about ensuring that it does meet the requirements of the SIRIA SuDS manual, and a bit of common sense, and of course that early integration within the landscape-led design. So yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, you're right, Laura. It is that how do we try and encourage within the procurement process, you know, of services, is that people, if they're getting services from a drainage engineer, particularly around surface water management, is that it's got that collaboration between a landscape architect and a drainage designer. Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you both of you. I think that covers that question pretty well. A really good response there. Just before we finish, thank you to everybody for logging in and watching the webinar. If you do have any further questions, please do get in touch. I'm sure Laura and Sophie will be happy to follow up with any responses to those questions. As well, you can provide some feedback from our session. Do tell us what your thoughts are. And you can get in touch as well. Our Twitter handles are @RTPI West Mids and @RTPI Northwest. There'll also be a survey as well, so you can provide your feedback. And just a reminder, the RTPI online events program for 2021 has been launched. You can visit the events page on the RTPI website to see the full program and book your places. The webinars will be free for RTPI members as well, which is great news. That's all from me. Thanks to everybody for joining us today. Thank you to Laura and Sophie as well for sharing your expertise and educating us planners. And have a good afternoon, everybody. Thank you.